Let's go now to Washington and Reed Collins.
Thank you, Tom. TASS has mentioned the tragedy, saying that the Challenger has exploded on takeoff, just a brief line from the Soviet Union. Let's get back to the White House now. Charles Bierbauer perhaps can fill us in on more of what the President is saying, doing, and thinking in this hour. Charles?
Reed, we had a chance to talk with the President, a few of us, a few moments ago. He described this as a very traumatic experience for him as well as for the nation. He indeed described the astronauts themselves as pioneers and said that there have always been hazards and people have always died on the frontier, that is part of the nature of pioneering. The President watched a replay of the explosion in the study next to his Oval Office just moments after it had happened, and he'd been notified of it. He called it a horrible thing. He said, "I can't rid myself of the thought of the sacrifice made by these astronauts and made by their families." Going on to note that of course included Christa McAuliffe, whose family had, even in the White House, in the Roosevelt Room, a few feet from where the President was standing, been named as that Teacher in Space program, which the President himself had instituted and had fostered. He said he wished that there was something that he and the nation could do to relieve the sense of loss for the families. The President went on to talk about the safety record of the American space program. He said that, "I am confident that there would be no flight till they," meaning the NASA folks, "are certain that it's safe." He remarked that this was indeed the first fatality in space that the American program has had. He said, too, that he's been so confident and now he feels so shocked. We asked the President how he felt about having the teacher, a citizen other than a regular astronaut, go up there. His remark on that was that this is what the space program is about. And to the children around the country who have watched so closely the development of Christa McAuliffe as an astronaut and the launch into space, he said that the children must learn, that must be made clear that life goes on. The President had, in fact, been anticipating a briefing, a background session on his State of the Union address tonight. He said, of course, that the State of the Union address will be given, that there will be mention made of the tragedy of the space shuttle. And he went on to say, but we can't stop the space program. We will continue. So indeed, Reed, the President very much shocked. The agony of this experience very visible on his face, his voice very soft and very disturbed by what has happened here. Reed?
Thank you, Charles Bierbauer, reporting live on the President's reaction to what has happened at the Kennedy Space Center scarcely a couple of hours ago. Mary Alice?
Thank you, Reed. With us here in New York is Dr. Robert Jastrow, who was founder and the first director of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies. He was also first chairman of NASA's Lunar Exploration Committee. Doctor, well, you have not been directly involved in the shuttle program. You've watched it carefully for its scientific and commercial applications. It's been fraught with problems lately, mechanical and electronic, but never with tragedy before.
I think it's all so terrible. It's difficult to give a collected judgment, but I think the first thing one has to do is look back over the record of the program, which is now almost 25 years old in manned flight, and has had just two serious accidents. One was 19 years ago, almost to the date, and now there's this one.
The fire on the launch pad, that's right.
I think the record is as good as the human brain can make it, and you have to remember that these men and women have a risk which is about the same as that of a military test pilot. It's a dangerous job, and it should never be thought otherwise. I think the other point, please go ahead.
I was going to say, this is going to stop flights for a while, one presumes, until everyone finds out what on earth went wrong. Why do we need to continue a manned space program? Or do we?
That's the second and the larger point. If some of my scientist friends say we only need unmanned vehicles, then the shuttle is not needed. But I think they're quite wrong. You need manned flight because we are going to put up into space satellites that cost as much as $1 billion. We're putting one up next year and later this year to look into the beginning of the universe and out to the edge of space. And at $1 billion, they can't be thrown away. They've got to be maintained and fixed by man in orbit. And on the commercial side, where we get our dollar and cents return from these investments, you've got to have men up there, the brain behind the eyeball, to fix these automated factories that we hope to put into space and make sure the product keeps flowing. It just is necessary to carry through this pioneering effort until it becomes routine.
As a physicist and scientist who's watched this program very carefully, what is your view of the shuttle's ambitious schedule this year?
Well, I thought it was a reasonable schedule. It's a little more than one a month, and there's no indication that the schedule was responsible for this defect. I don't know what the cause was, but I think that we can look forward to monthly and then bi-weekly and then even more frequent launches. We just must push ahead if it is important to have man in space, and it seems to me and to most people that it is.
I'm going to ask you to speculate because it's something that none of us can tell right now, but you've been in mission control before. There are computers in there that give practically instantaneous readouts of what's happening inside that shuttle. How fast would those computers be able to generate information on what happened this morning?
You know,
in
Mary,
an uncontrolled, controlled explosion, which is what happened?
Yes, you have to be right on top of it to answer that question. Whether all the data came in or some vital piece of information was missing in the explosion itself is something I don't know. Only the people who are on top of it know, and only they can tell how long it will take to put the story together.
Talk to me a little bit about the training that these people go through. You heard Senator Jake Garn just moments ago talking about his training. It sounds like military test pilot training. Well,
it is, and as I mentioned, the fatalities, the risk is about the same as that of a military test pilot. They're important jobs, they're dangerous jobs, and the men and women who lay their lives on the line know that, and they do something that the nation is grateful to them for. It's terrible in an extra dimension that a school teacher, a wife, and a mother was also on board. But as the President said just recently, the purpose of the whole program is to make this flight routine. And
available to civilians.
Yes, because it will not be trained military test pilots and professional astronauts who will be fixing those factories and fixing those telescopes and those scientific platforms. We must overcome this pioneering difficulty and pass into a time when a shuttle flight doesn't even get on the pages of the newspaper.
You had not seen that the replay of what happened this morning before you were sitting with me, and you had a very tough time looking at it.
Indeed, well, it's just too terrible. And if you were closer to it, it would be worse yet. But I must repeat again that, you know, if there is a purpose to man in space, and there is, we need him for science and for the dollar and cents return on the program, then the shuttle is the way to go. And we must persist.
I want to go back to a very specific point. And again, I don't know if you can answer this because of your lack of direct involvement in the shuttle flight. This is the first shuttle in which, as far as we know, in which there were no ejection seats. Now, whether or not an ejection seat would have helped save the lives up there is obviously debatable.
I'm not informed well enough to say, but it looked to me as though the end was instantaneous in just viewing the tape of that explosion.
Okay, Dr. Robert Jastrow of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, thanks for being with us. We're going now to Dave Walker.
We will join Dave shortly, Mary Alice, with more information and background on what has happened today. First, Concord, New Hampshire, of course, the town from which the first school teacher in space, Christa McAuliffe, came, is stunned today. Reporter Howard Nielsen is at Concord, New Hampshire High School, where Christa McAuliffe taught and where they were watching this morning. Howard.
Yes, it's a state of shock here. The students at Concord High School were in a cafeteria watching the shoot live through a satellite arrangement with public broadcasting. There was a lot of joy, a lot of excitement, noisemakers cheering, yelling as the liftoff went. At first, it was not apparent what had happened. Nobody could quite understand it. And then, all of a sudden, one of the officials of the school realized that there had been this tragic event. He ordered the television monitor turned off, asked that everyone quiet down. Then it settled in. People realized what had happened. There was silence. And then students began crying. The news media, who had been in the cafeteria prepared to cover this event, were asked to leave the school. They did. The students then went to their individual classrooms. The administration officials went to the administrative offices to determine what to do. There was some brief counseling of students by teachers, and then the students were released to go home to their parents. We understand that there is a possibility of a news conference sometime around 3 o'clock this afternoon. Back to you.
Howard, I missed just a portion of what you said there, some activity here. Did you say the students are being sent home or that considerations being given to that?
The students have been sent home.
All right, thank you. Reporter Howard Nielsen at Concord, New Hampshire High School, a high school located in a city of about 30,000 people, the city that was home for crew member Christa McAuliffe. Joining us right now is Dave Walker with more information and some personal observations on space shuttle launches. Dave?
Thanks, Bob. And having observed numerous launches at the Kennedy Space Center over the years, the personal experience is awe-inspiring, as you might expect, and particularly when you view it for the very first time, you actually feel the impact of the combustion of the rockets. You see the fire developing underneath as you observe this from about 5 miles away. And then, at the speed of sound, of course, you can begin to feel the impact. It's a popping noise, and there's a lot of palmetto around, or at least there used to be, the Kennedy Space Center. You can hear that begin to rattle. You can hear birds flying off, and there used to even be some rattlesnakes and alligators. They would become agitated themselves. But this is generally what it looks like. Not having observed a shuttle launch, I've observed several of the Apollo missions. But the force that is created here is enormous. And as I said, once again, when you're at the viewing center, the VIP stand or the press stand, you don't hear anything at first. You just see this huge fireball. And then a few moments later, you begin to hear a popping noise. And of course, everybody on the viewing stand, including the news media, as has become custom, begins cheering, applauding, saying, "Go, go." It is indeed one of the most startling experiences of my lifetime as a reporter. And, of course, today's developments draw attention as we try to possibly understand what happened. With us now is Professor Ben T. Zinn. He is Professor of Aerospace Engineering at Georgia Tech University. And, Professor, as you look at this, you can see a little bit of burning here on the propellant booster of the shuttle, and then you see the massive explosion. I know you have done some research into solid boosters. As you look at that, what would you speculate might have happened?
It looks like an explosion to me, and there's a phenomenon known as combustion instability, which often occurs in both solid and liquid propellant rocket motors. And if I had to make a guess at this time based on limited amount of information, I would guess that an instability occurred in the solid booster and caused the explosion.
So an instability in the solid booster in some form or fashion somehow ignited the enormous booster which is carried underneath the shuttle, causing the massive explosion. And you were telling me earlier that they have had some problems with those solid boosters. What sort of problems have they encountered?
Well, normally when we have a combustion instability, what happens is the pressure inside the solid propellant does not follow the pre-designed pressure time history. And
in other words, it has to burn at a certain rate.
It has to burn at a certain rate, and when an instability occurs, we obtain pressure oscillations. You can think of the booster as if it is an organ pipe in which a solid propellant is burning. And the instability is a disturbance, and it disturbs the...
Now, those are the solid boosters we want to point out to our viewers on either side of the liquid booster underneath the shuttle.
Well, if you see the end of on the two sides, you see the two ends of the solid boosters, and you can think of them as two organ pipes which are loaded with solid propellant. And when an instability occurs, you'll obtain longitudinal oscillations along the booster, pressure oscillations or pressure waves which are running back and forth, and they interfere with the burning process. They can cause acceleration of the burning process. They can result in extreme buildup of pressures, abnormal burning of the solid propellant, and eventually an explosion. If the casing is not strong enough to withstand the sufficiently large pressures which can build inside, the whole thing can explode. And maybe this would happen.
So these oscillations, as you described them, they run up and down the length of the solid booster itself, causing the booster itself to become destabilized in some form or fashion.
Well, basically, they destabilize the burning process of the solid propellant.